Salam everyone. I hope you have had a good time up till now. And thank you so much once again for organizing this conference on Afghanistan, and what a better place to present my topic other than the Institute of Ismaili Studies, as Dr. Hakim mentioned, where I also studied almost 2 years ago now. So today I'm going to talk about the Ismaili communities of Afghanistan, and since I'm going to talk about Afghanistan as well, it would be very important for me to draw some connections between the Ismaili community or the Ismaili Imamat on the one hand and Afghanistan as a nation state on the other hand. But before I turn to this point, it's also important to talk about Afghanistan's Islam, which has a historical connection both to Afghanistan as well as Ismaili communities in that country. And this picture at the background is, by the way, the Divan of Ismaili Imamat, as it's called in Lisbon, Portugal, or the headquarters of the Ismaili community. Islam in general, and Afghanistan's Islam in particular, has taken various forms in the changing geopolitical milieu of the last 2 centuries. With changing geopolitics, the scholarship on Afghanistan Islams, as Dr. Baiza mentioned earlier as well, have attracted attention from different fields, but not so much than scholars with training in political science, militancy, and terrorism. It's thus no surprise that much of the scholarship on Afghanistan Islam, especially after the 1970s, has been focused on political Islam, a process what Niall Green calls politicalization of Islam in that country. This is not to say that there are no studies on other expressions of Afghanistan's Islam. There are studies now that tell us both Afghanistan and the Muslim Ummah are not a monolith, that's something which is uniform, massive, inflexible, but rather a mosaic. That's something that's a combination of diverse elements forming a more or less of a coherent whole. Thus, viewing Islam as a mosaic enables us to see the variety of ways in which Islam is practiced by different Muslim communities, not just in Afghanistan, but worldwide. However, a lot of people are viewing Afghanistan and Islam, as I mentioned just now, as a mosaic. And so when we look at Afghanistan, actually, much like the Muslim Ummah itself, Afghanistan is also not a singular entity, as imagined by some, but a rather diverse society, something that should have been understood by now. But the continuous attempts and continuous failure of different Afghan regimes and rulers make one wonder, does history not really repeat itself? The ethno-nationalist policies of one Afghan Amir to a modernization project of the other, as well as the ideologies such as communism, democracy, and Islamic, failed, sometimes more than once actually, to homogenize Afghanistan's communities. But attempts are still being made to follow on the footsteps of previous regimes and ideologies. Despite their failure, however, these attempts have had a long-lasting impact on the Muslim communities inside and outside of Afghanistan. For example, the nationalist policies of Amir Abdurrahman Khan not only weakened the traditional Sufi communities such as the Naqshbandi Mujaddidis, but it also paved way for the rise of modern and literalistic approach to Islam in the form of Wahhabism, which to a great extent has influenced a lot of movements, including the Taliban. It is not, however, just national states or nation states that attempt to homogenize its subject, but also religious communities. Among the many religious communities of Afghanistan, the Shiʿa Imami Ismaili Muslims, as they are officially called today, make up one such Islam of Afghanistan. The Ismailis of Afghanistan are part of a global Ismaili community which consists of diverse ethno-linguistic groups spread across the world. In the current scholarship on the Ismailis, the global Ismaili communities are divided into traditions and linked to a past religious figure who might have initiated these communities to the Ismaili tariqa. Afghanistan's Badakhshan Ismailis are, for example, connected to the Fatimid Da'i or missionary, Persian poet and philosopher Nasir-i Khusraw, and their Hazara co-religionists are sometimes believed to be initiated to the Ismaili tariqa by a Da'i called Ghiyath Isfahani from Persia. Historically, however, neither of these two dignitaries nor the people who followed them referred to themselves as Shiʿa Imami Ismaili Muslims, despite the fact that they acknowledged and accepted the Imamate of Ismaili Imams and the Fatimid Empire. The word Ismaili or Ismailiya was an external label that was used for the Ismailis because they believed that the true Imam after Imam Jafar Sadiq is held their son Ismail and not Musa Kazim as believed by 12 Shias. The Ismailis themselves referred to their movement as Al-Dawa Al-Adiyah or Dawat-e-Haq, or the rightly guided mission, which was a religio-political movement first to establish a Shia Khilafat, which they did in present-day Tunisia and later founded like the modern city of Cairo from where they ruled. With the downfall of their empire in Egypt and castles in Persia, especially the Alamut castle, however, various Ismaili communities survived in different parts of the world, including modern-day Afghanistan, China, Iran, Syria, India, Tajikistan, and Pakistan. And historically, actually, each of these Ismaili communities in these countries as well as India evolved in a different cultural, religious, and socio-political environment, factors which shaped their religious beliefs and doctrines as well as the ways in which they practiced Islam. An interesting question that arises is how did these Ismaili communities outside the Fatimid Empire and Persia survived after the fall of their empire and loss of territories in Persia? There's very little research that can tell us about their lives after the death of Nasir-i Khusraw in Badakhshan, sometimes in the 11th century, especially about the last 4 centuries. And hopefully once Dr. Baizaz's book on the Hazara Ismailis of Afghanistan comes out, we will know a little bit more about these communities and their activities. But what we know from oral tradition and some preserved text is that much like other Sufi communities, the Ismailis also developed various religious and spiritual institutions that overlooked the community's religious and socio-political affairs. 2 important religious offices that operated in Afghanistan and the region in Central Asia were the religious institution of what they would call Pir and their appointed representatives Khalifa or Khulafa, the plural. At least from the 17th century onwards, some of these Pirs managed to contact Ismaili Imams in Persia and later in India, and this connection continued intermittently at least with some of the Pirs until the 21st century. The network of these Pirs were not confined to geography or cultures, but were beyond these categories, especially in the case of Afghanistan and Central Asia. The Ismaili communities in Afghanistan and other parts of Central Asia would often use the term, among their own circles, the term Hampira, a person or group of people who followed the same Pir, to refer to themselves internally. To the outsider, they would use different kind of names, including Panjtani that I used in this presentation, but there were others as well, including Ismailiya, of course, sometimes, meaning those by Panjtani, they would usually refer to themselves because they had a lot of devotion to the Ahl Bayt or Ahl Bayt of Prophet Muhammad or his family. Sometimes they would also use like the term Maulai. But with the boundary demarcation in the region and the rise of nation states, most Ismaili Pirs had to migrate from one region or one territory to another. But thanks to their trans-regional spiritual networks, their followers supported them resettle in these new territories, whether it was in Badakhshan, Chitral, or some parts of China. In Afghanistan particularly, the attitude of Afghan emirs and British and Russians in their neighboring looks like it was changing from one ruler or one like regime to the other towards the Ismailis and their peers. For example, the Afghan emirs, especially Amir Abdurrahman Khan's policies, and which were not only just like for the Ismailis but for the larger Sufi communities, forced some of these peers to migrate from Badakhshan to neighboring regions such as Chitral. And today, for example, the Ismaili Imamat and the institution represent and speak for these communities in Afghanistan. But it was these local forms of authorities that negotiated the Ismaili community's complex religious identities in the face of changing and often hostile religio-political environments before the 21st century. Much like the Naqshbandi Sufi orders or Sufi communities, however, the Ismailis' traditional religious networks also survived, but it was like changed or transformed only in the 21st century, about which I will be talking. Their traditional authority and network actually only dissolved in the early 2000s when the Ismaili Imamat established direct contact with the vast majority of Ismaili communities and established what people would call Ismaili Imamat institutions. There were also like other things which help these communities preserve their faith, and a lot of it was mostly like the way they practice Islam in the forms of rites and rituals. And these rites and rituals range like from, let's say, Quran Khani, Juma Nashini in central Afghanistan, where Hazara communities were living or studying books of the 11th century Persian poet Nasir-i Khusraw. But in Badakhshan, they had their own other rituals which were a little bit different, including visiting shrines. But there was one major event, especially in the late 19th century, which defines the modern day dynamics of the community, and that was the migration of the 46th Ismaili Imam, or the first one to bear the title of Agha Khan, from Persia to Hindustan or India in the 19th century. This event continues to define and shape the contemporary dynamics of the global Ismaili community. And the Imam's migration to Hindustan gave rise to new questions about the Ismaili community's self-portrayal, their religious orientation, the community's future institutional structure. In this political upheaval of empire and state building, Ismailis, much like any other Muslim or otherwise religious communities, not only started to define themselves more rigidly, but also started to draw boundaries between themselves and other religious communities, including the Asnashiris, with which they shared like a common historical belief system to a great extent, especially on ideas about like Imamat, which I will be talking. So Afghanistan Ismailis in the 1970s, much like any other community of Afghanistan, were like without a centralized authority to a certain extent, although there were like religious figures who sometimes claimed that they represented the Ismailis. But as a community, they were also like divided into opposing political parties, especially Khalq and Saza, and this is specifically true for Ismailis in Badakhshan, Afghanistan. And this political division like had far-reaching consequences for the Ismailis of Afghanistan, which again continues to shape and inform their internal dynamics today in Afghanistan as well as in the diaspora. So in Shoghnan, for example, in the 1980s, which is a small district in Badakhshan, Afghanistan, almost the whole population is Ismaili. This political difference led the Ismailis of Shoghnan, for example, it became a bloodshed event in their history, and members of the community were killed by their own fellow Ismailis, just like any other community again in Afghanistan, whether ethnic group or religious communities. And the Ismaili Imam's message of brotherhood, promoting diversity and pluralism, at that time did not reach its followers in Badakhshan, in the 1980s at least. Almost the same was true for Hazara Ismailis who lived in central Afghanistan, but being at the center of politics, Afghan politics, also meant that they were a more direct player in Afghanistan politics during the Cold War. This gave some members of the community economic and political privileges, especially depending on the regime they supported and whether that regime succeeded or failed. As a result of these political differences between various Ismaili communities, the community's reception of the Ismaili Imamat's modernization projects also varied. In the early years of like 21st century or beginning in the 1990s, when the institutions started building, when the Ismaili Imamat started building the institution in Afghanistan, a scholar, for example, termed these institutional buildings as the dawn of a new era for the Ismailis of Afghanistan. This era, according to him, began with the migration of Afghanistan's Ismailis to Pakistan in the 1990s, which connected them to the global Ismaili community. In Pakistan, the Ismaili Imamat institutions not only gave shelter, food, and healthcare facilities to the new immigrants, but also assisted the newly arrived Ismailis in finding accommodations, jobs, enrolling younger members of the community into schools and colleges and universities, especially those run by the Agha Khan Development Network. The present Ismaili Imam himself paid a visit to these communities in October 2000 and instructed Afghanistan's Ismailis in Pakistan to live by the ethics of Islam, learn English language, and invest in education. The Pakistani Ismaili communities were an equal partner in assisting their co-religionists from Afghanistan voluntarily. Upon their return to Afghanistan, these Afghan immigrants, or Hazara and Badakhshani immigrants to be precise, took active part in establishing the Imamat institutions in Afghanistan, which are actively working in Afghanistan to this day. As mentioned earlier, however, the internal political differences once again came to surface during the Republic times from 2002 to 2021. And when the Ismaili institution made new leadership appointments, they prioritized educated men and women over traditional forms of leadership. These new appointments, which did not take into account the internal political dynamics of various Ismaili communities, led to issues of representation within the Ismaili institution in Afghanistan. Instead of acknowledging and highlighting these political differences, the institution stressed more on the Ismailis' religious identity, which has since then become part of their everyday lives, often overshadowing their ethnic, social, and political affiliations or identities. With the connection, while the connection with the global Ismaili community and Ismaili institution impacted Afghanistan's Ismailis in many positive ways, in few years' time, new problems arose. One of these challenges, in my personal opinion, was the very attitude of the institution towards traditional religious beliefs and practices. The Ismailis of Afghanistan, like 12 Shi'a communities, view Imamat as a divinely chosen authority. The Imam in Shi'a Islam, whether it's Ismaili or Twelver, is believed to have a special, is like a divine office, and the Imam is believed to have a special divine knowledge or ilm. And as God's chosen man, only he can reveal to human beings the true interpretation and spiritual or the batin or the hidden meanings of the Quran and the message of Islam. The Imam's entry into Afghanistan was, however, portrayed more as a humanitarian and philanthropist, an association he does not like, than the Imam with characteristic just mentioned above. Highlighting the worldly and political achievements of the Ismaili Imam to Afghanistan's Ismaili communities, the Ismaili leadership presented the Imam more like a celebrity than Imam in the traditional Shia sense. As a scholar such as Faisal Devji has observed, and I quote, "For institutions that now claim to be global or transnational ones, as you can see in this chart, this bureaucracy is curiously old-fashioned in its very modernity, taking on a vicarious identification with the post-colonial states of the 1960s and 70s, not least in the obsessive attention given to the Agha Khan's various meetings with presidents, prime ministers or monarchs and the honors bestowed upon him. Not only is this coverage reminiscent of the official media representation of precedents for life, but by bathing the Imam in the reflective glory of others, ends up both diminishing and secularizing his religious authority in a potentially damaging way. After all, the Ismailis, as you saw in the first picture, have for decades now had a flag, anthem, and constitution. And more recently, the Agha Khan has managed to secure diplomatic status for his representatives in certain countries, with which he sometimes signs protocols of understanding as if he were head of a state," unquote. With such a model of authority, modern model of authority, and while the Ismaili Imam has continuously emphasized and instructed his followers, and he says this in his speeches as well, and instructions to institutional leadership to maintain a balance between deen and dunya, faith and the world, the ground realities, a lot of which might also arise from changing needs of different societies, make it difficult to maintain this balance. This failure has recently led to different forms of expression among various Ismaili communities who claim to represent and or to revive the traditional Ismaili thought, and they are attracting attention from various Ismaili communities, including some from Afghanistan. The changes brought by the Ismaili institution, where local rites and rituals are being homogenized and local forms of authorities are being replaced by modern institutions in the changing political context such as Afghanistan, one wonders how might common members of the community function if the present or the next government, if there is a next government, decides to close the Ismaili institutions in Afghanistan, as recently happened in Tajikistan. With recent migration of Ismaili communities from Afghanistan to different parts of the world has posed its own challenges to Afghanistan's Ismaili communities both inside and outside Afghanistan. While these challenges are beyond my own expertise to discuss and beyond the scope of the short presentation, some of them might revolve around issues of representation both inside Afghanistan and among the global Ismaili communities. In the current political situation, Afghanistan's Ismailis and the Imamat institutions in that country face new challenges which will only unfold in an uncertain future. Thank you.